Investigate that crime scene and report back to me with your findings. That's all for now.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have finally made it. There are a lot of different ways I thought of prefacing a review of Resident Evil Requiem, but despite the numerous introductory statements I had drummed up in my head, the one big sentiment my mind kept falling on was that I did, indeed, like it. Attach Eiffel Tower size asterisk here. Yeah, to be blunt, Resident Evil Requiem turned out to be one of the strangest entries in the series for me. This isn't even one of those mixed bag cases we often see within this series. No, RE9 is a game that is so all over the goddamn place, it genuinely racks my brain. But if you came to this video with the sole intention of finding out whether or not I liked it overall, you can rest assured. The game is pretty good, and I honestly could name it the best RE Engine title if I'm feeling generous enough. It was a game I felt had really capitalized on some of its ideas, a game that felt like a proper evolution of 30-year design principles, a game I had loads of fun playing, a game that reminded me why I even fell in love with the series in the first place. But anytime I extended even the slightest modicum of praise, I was immediately reminded of the game's several flaws, many of which I couldn't merely just brush off either. But I'm not going to waste any more of mine or your guys' time with this preamble bullshit. This video is going to be super duper long, and I'd rather not dwell on anything that isn't totally substantial. Might want to get comfortable. I think you and I are going to get to know each other quite well. To kick things off, I'll start with what was perhaps the biggest talking point leading up to Requiem's release. The thing I personally could not stop thinking about the most during that time, which is, of course, how they were going to implement two different perspectives. As we should all know by now, Resident Evil Requiem gives players a choice between using first-person or third-person perspective, with the game recommended first-person for Grace and third-person for Leon. But after getting a feel for it myself, I winded up seeing very little to no reason to use a first-person over third-person. The idea here is obvious. First-person puts you right up in direct eye shot, allowing for a more immersive experience. Everything feels scarier when you're as up close to the experience as possible. But the interesting thing to consider here is that this feature goes deeper than a mere perspective change. Movement and even entire mechanics are different depending on which one you end up going with. And it's in these differences that make third person a vastly more intuitive option over first person. It even gets to the point where I legit wonder how anyone could even pick first person given how poorly implemented it was, compared to third person. For one thing, the first person perspective has a severe field of view issue, where the narrowness and claustrophobia are ramped up even further than in 7 and 8, two games that had FOV issues already, especially the latter. And if we're talking the way this affects movement, Requiem's incredibly boxed-in FOV will make characters feel like they're trudging through quicksand. This game already has some pretty wonky controls, but restricting players' field of view to 45 motherfucking degrees does nothing but exacerbate these issues. Now every bit of movement feels even more weighty, even more sluggish, and worst of all, it makes everything feel painfully slow. I understand the whole point of narrowing your field of view was to instill suspense and such, but why should this decision come at the expense of your audience's patience and more importantly their health? I'm not joking about the latter either. Several players have expressed feelings of motion sickness and even nausea through playing in first person. And this game has the fucking gall to not only recommend playing Grace's sections this way, but to enable it by default. Thank Christ it gives you the option between this and third person. I wouldn't have even bothered playing the game had this feature not existed. But it's not as if necessary features aren't missing in Requiem, because for some bizarre reason, the game outright lacks an FOV slider, despite earlier Resident Evil titles, such as the one that came out 9 years ago, having it. Is immersion really so important that you'd feel the need to neglect one of the most basic quality of life features? I'm sorry, but this is fucking egregious. Want to get immersed and not feel like you're going through vertigo? Well, if you're on PC, you can use mods, but if you're a console player, you're just shit out of luck. Looks like you're stuck with third person, which, even ignoring these issues you really shouldn't ignore, is just a better option when it comes to gameplay anyway. First person omits Grace's stumbling mechanic as I trade off for his decreased FOV, which I wouldn't exactly call a favorable compromise. Because if you're really aiming to instill feelings of panic in a player, then these numerous little quirks will do the trick much better than constricting the player's field of view to a nauseating degree. At least, that's how I feel. And I know a lot of people aren't fond of this sort of thing, but allow me to explain the benefits of something like a panic feature real quick. People were pretty quick to point out the Haunting Ground similarities, and in that game, when Fiona reaches a certain level of stress, she freaks out, causing the player to lose much but not all control, with stumbles and an increase in collision thrown into the mix, to really illustrate the fact that you're fucking panicking, losing your goddamn shit. And Grace's fits of panicking work pretty similarly in Requiem. Grace will sometimes enter a state of panic where the controls are tightened, colliding with geometry causes greater impact, and best of all, she'll stumble and fall to the floor at random. This is a pretty efficient way in building tension because it allows us players to really feel what Grace is feeling in these moments. The fear has taken over her ability to stay composed, resulting in completely erratic behavior. And what this means for gameplay is that players will have to quickly but carefully adjust their movements, and while it does take away a lot of the player's control, it leaves just enough to allow players to make those necessary adjustments in order to navigate the area. Try to imagine yourself in Grace's shoes during, say, this section right here. Most people would, understandably, react the same way. They'd lose the ability to focus, the ability to move leisurely, etc. And I think this sort of fear was expressed pretty well through this little gameplay quirk. I will say that it's a bit disappointing to relegate this feature to just a few certain sections, when it could have been a full-fledged mechanic like it was in the aforementioned Haunting Ground. But now that I've got that out of the way, it's time to take a deeper dive into Grace's gameplay and by extension, the game's survival horror elements. However, in the very unfortunate case of Resident Evil 7, the reason I was so harsh is because I'm not sure if we're ever going to get a true survival horror like the classics ever again. Oh, how wrong I was. Oh, how I should have had more faith in Capcom. Oh, how did they deliver on their promise to bring back the classic style survival horror us diehards had been longing for. Okay, to be more realistic, it's not perfect, and there's definitely a couple of issues here that I'll address later on. But in terms of bringing those original trilogy vibes to the modern era, Requiem does a far better job at it than Resident Evil 7 could ever dream of. It didn't take long for the Care Center to become a fan favorite, and after 2 playthroughs, it's not hard to see why it's so strongly lauded. Hell, to be completely honest with you, I think the Care Center is amongst the greatest areas in franchise history. It's honestly up there with the likes of the Spencer Mansion, Raccoon City Police Department, and Salazar's Castle. It's a pretty intricately designed area that rewards clever routing and inventory management just like in those old games. But why highlight how reminiscent it is of those iconic locations when I could, instead, discuss the many ways in which it expands upon the franchise's core design principles? I could just point out the features, mechanics, and ideals that made their triumphant return in Requiem, and believe me, things like ink ribbons and crimson heads coming back is exciting. Like, dude, ink ribbons are back, the decision making is back, the concept of getting lost is back. Like, Capcom, my erection can only be so big. Like, calm down, please. I could also reiterate a lot of the things regarding risk-reward strategizing that I've gone over time and time again, as this element is echoed quite well through things such as the Requiem gun and the encounter with the chef. But at the same time, I'd be ignoring just how much Requiem pushes the series forward with its new features, mechanics, and ideals. If, say, Resident Evil 7 felt like a modernization of the classic RE formula, then Requiem's Care Center feels like the logical evolution of that classic formula. Not only is it cut from the same cloth as those classic games, but it also introduces new mechanics that help to put an interesting twist on a lot of the things that made the survival era of Resident Evil so special. The first of these I want to focus on is the added emphasis on stealth. Survival horror REs have always stressed the player's ability to skirt around enemies to preserve items, but what Requiem does is introduce a variety of different tools and gimmicks, allowing players to adopt a more stealthy approach in their pursuit of survival. on top of a design and layout flexible enough to accommodate said approach. These additions include contextual gimmicks that the player can exploit to flank zombie positions, and a brand new type of weapon whose depth is going to take a few minutes to explore. So why don't I start exploring the former first? Once promotion for the game started kicking into overdrive, the team behind Requiem were not shy about revealing just how human Requiem zombies are going to feel. Like, they hammered this shit in nearly as much as the multiple perspectives. They were confident as hell about this shit, and they had every right to be. Although, once news of this broke, I admit I was a bit skeptical in how this was going to be implemented to the game's benefit beyond a surface level. Needless to say though, Requiem ramping up the intimacy of the zombies wound up playing a crucial role in how you go about your business. Given that Grace is wandering a complex sanatorium, you'll come across people from a wide range of occupations, each of which lent themselves to these contextual gimmicks I mentioned earlier. Gimmicks that include a nurse that cleans up bloodstains, a night watch that gets distracted by lights that are left on, and a blind patient who gets extremely violent at the slightest bit of noise. I could go on. Each of them, again, can be exploited to bypass them at the expense of very little to no resources. Studying their patterns in the areas surrounding them, then using that knowledge to bypass them is nothing short of satisfying. Flicking on the lights down the hall so I can get the night watch and move away from my desired destination, carefully inspecting the chef to wait for the perfect time to run past him, and to throw a bit of humor into the mix, manipulating the blind zombie to just fuck another zombie shit up. Apparently you can use a strat to kill Chunk, which is really something. Stuff like this makes me ecstatic for that inevitable insanity playthrough where strats like these are going to come so in handy. And I don't think I need to discuss the narrative depth that comes with the design choice, but I'm going to anyway, bitch. Resident Evil has always done a pretty good job in highlighting the tragedy angle of a zombie apocalypse, but never before has that, again, element of intimacy felt stronger than it does here in Requiem. We're now seeing people really cling onto that last bit of humanity they have left, and the worst part about it is that this last bit of humanity in question is their occupation. They were zombies figuratively, but now they're zombies literally. Hardcore, man. But moving on, Requiem introduces a new type of weapon for Grace to use, the hemolytic injector. A weapon whose primary function is to prevent reanimation. If you've played the RE1 remake before, think the lighter and fluid canteen, only with an added element of stealth. And much like the lighter and fluid from RE1R, the injectors are tied to these aspects of resourceful decision making. Given present circumstances, is it a wise decision to spend the necessary resources to acquire an injector? Will it be a tool you'll use in order to spare other resources, or will you have no choice to use it because you went big dum-dum mode and killed way too many zombies? It's a neat little evolution of the aforementioned lighter and fluid, but the twist here is that the injectors don't exactly benefit Grace as much as they do Leon. One of the things I was hoping to see with the split protagonist structure was a tangible dynamic between them. You know, having the two styles organically play off of each other. How you play as Grace influencing how you play as Leon, vice versa, that sort of thing. And I'm happy to say that does indeed happen during the Care Center portion of this game. And it comes back to what I was discussing with those aforementioned injectors. Because if you don't properly dispose of a zombie and you leave the deceased alone for too long, they return. Yes, as I said earlier, Crimson Heads have returned. In essence, at least. They're not called Crimson Heads, they're called Blister Heads now, but their effect and premise are the same, basically. They're unpredictable, can literally hit you with a devastating combo, and best of all, can only be damaged through headshots. Needless to say, you're going to want to ensure that you'll encounter as little of them as possible. Even with Leon, they can be some tough bastard to deal with, at least during these early moments of the game where you don't have much in your arsenal. So what I'm trying to get at here is that the smarter you are with Grace, the less Leon will have to deal with in return. I think I would have preferred it if these situations were reversed, it kind of feels more sensible, but I'm happy something like this was even considered to begin with. However, the unfortunate thing here is that this entire concept never comes up again, and this is the only area where the two campaigns actually affect each other. Once the care center is taken care of, Grace and Leon go their separate ways, and that is such a bummer, man. It becomes even more disappointing when you consider that there were two sections later on in the game that could have seen something like what we saw during the care center. For instance, you could have made the girl a dedicated boss fight for Leon, but the amount of times Grace exposes her to the light could dictate the amount of health she starts off with. I know I'm just spitballing over here, but regardless, I think we all can agree that there was a lot of potential here that was just kinda wasted. Those moments where Leon was left with the zombies Grace killed, didn't kill, or allowed to reanimate, ended up becoming a mere glimpse into something that could have been so much bigger. Hell, Grace encounters one of two chunks, correct? Maybe if Chunk allowed the one she encounters to live, perhaps Leon could have fought both chunks in the end? Okay, now I'm really starting to get ahead of myself. But as much as I did enjoy going through the care center, I can't exactly say it's perfect or that I didn't have any gripes with it. The first of which I would like to point out is another case of missed potential, this time regarding a potential stalker segment. Once you acquire the corrosive and are ready to solve the second quartz puzzle, Gideon drops by to say hello. Grace scurries off in a hurry, then Gideon just kinda fucks off and lets Grace carry on as if she isn't instrumental for his schemes. Gotta say, man, they miss out on something truly special here. The whole direction of that cutscene seemed to hint at the possibility of Gideon becoming a stalker type enemy here, but nothing really comes from it, and Gideon winds up looking like a fool for letting Grace go. It would have been pretty sick too. Considering Gideon was able to subdue Leon with relative ease, we can see just how imposing he really is. And if we were to take his vast intellect into consideration, one can only imagine the absolute insane tactics he'd undergo in his pursuit of Grace. But again, Gideon is totally wasted here, and to further extend this complaint regarding stalkers, Chunk doesn't really function as one either. He only patrols one small hallway, and getting around him isn't much of a task at all. Hell, if anything, Grace really only has one stalker, and that's the girl, who appears in stalker fashion during 3 different sections. Ironically, it's the first time we see her where she's the most terrifying. Her second roundabout is pretty good, but following your first playthrough, it should be easy to pinpoint when and where she shows up. Her last segment is even worse in this regard. Sure, it was frantic the first time around, but for my second rodeo, it was nothing short of a cakewalk. The most optimal route is painfully obvious, and the lights that deter her pursuit so badly, it's honestly kinda hilarious. But getting back to the first time we see her, the girl is an absolute fucking menace. Given that it's right in the beginning of the game, the player is severely limited in their methods of escaping her. You don't even have a gun at this point. You're given, what, 1 ink ribbon, 1 empty bottle, and 1 healing item? Good fucking luck. What's more is that moving a huge cabinet to reach a key on a higher shelf is a requirement to progress, and should you move it with a bit too much force, a tray will fall from it, creating enough noise to give away your position. I don't know how finicky my hands are, but this wound up happening during both of my playthroughs, and I shit you not, on both occasions I immediately felt my throat drop to my stomach. And don't think the well-lit room you started off in is going to work as a safe haven more than once, because this lanky ass motherfucker kills the lights the moment you see refuge there. With all of this in mind, the section becomes a matter of carefully studying the girl's movement patterns, so you may go about your business and know exactly what to do should things go south. It's a pretty remarkable way to open the game, and a thankful deviation from the way 7 and 8 began their games. It's like Capcom knew how painfully slow the starts of those 2 games were. Yeah man, it's almost as if you should begin your games with some actual fucking gameplay, and not the segmented bullshit that wastes a near hour of your time. Moving along, Resident Evil Requiem accomplishes the one thing I didn't think Capcom could ever accomplish with these goddamn games. So many consecutive entries that all shared a major problem that Requiem has since finally figured out a solution to. Crafting is actually interested now. I can't believe it, but they finally did it. They actually made it to where you actually have to use your goddamn brain in order to craft. Who'da thunk it? And all it took was relegating several different items to have a crafting requirement on top of the usual curatives and ammunition for this crafting mechanic to actually work. Furthermore, the device you use to even craft is a resource in and of itself. A standard blood collector has a limit of 100, while an upgrade can boost that limit to 150 at the cost of 6 antique coins. And that boost is required if you plan on maximizing Grace's health and firepower. Furthermore, the resource economy here is pretty well balanced. The game offers players a choice to risk killing zombies for more blood to spend on crafting, but also rewards exploration by placing various blood buckets throughout the map, many of which are hidden behind doors that must be unlocked. There's definitely an emphasis on having to make smart choices that'll benefit your current situation, but it never felt as if there wasn't a single drop of blood to go around. It all depends on what your current situation is that'll influence your crafting decisions. Oh, I think I'm satisfied with what I'm carrying. So now I can use whatever blood I have left to craft some Requiem ammo in order to kill Mr. X and Gordon Ramsay's love child over here. Oh, I've got a maxed out blood collector and an empty injector just sitting in my pocket. I think I'll risk it all to give myself the necessary boost in firepower. These are two pretty common scenarios the average player may be faced with, but it does highlight how well this feature was implemented and how it incentivizes a player to carefully analyze what they're currently carrying, and using that knowledge to make decisions regarding crafting. However, I do think it was a bit of a misstep to make ink ribbons an item you can craft. The game's already pretty generous with the amount of ink ribbons you'd find, so much so that I was able to use them pretty casually without fear of losing a significant amount of progress. If I had gone back and played this game on the modern setting, I doubt anything would have felt any different. Granted, the earlier games also did kind of have an issue with making ink ribbons too abundant, but they didn't have the feature of craftable ink ribbons either, and that is a thing in this game, which means that, yeah, the ink ribbons don't really affect your decision making really all that much, to be honest. It's not a game breaker by any means though, but it was something that I thought I'd mention real quick. There's one other thing I think I should mention real quick that may be even less of a game breaker, but it was something I could not stop thinking about during both of my playthroughs. This will hopefully be the last thing I discuss before I finally move on to Leon's gameplay, and with that out of the way, there was something that happens at the very end of this section I found to be incredibly strange. Grace is about to solve the puzzle to acquire the last quartz piece when, oh fuck, it's in Braille. So she has to snatch Emily to do it for her, since she's blind and can read Braille, you know. This is odd to me because if we're paying attention to the two previous puzzles, they were also in Braille, and the symbols on the final puzzle aren't any different, nor are they in a different order than the two others. And Grace is literally gifted with the solution. She could have just easily memorized the Braille on the other two puzzles since, you know, they're presented in the exact same fashion. Hell, not even that, she could have just brute forced it and had that bitch solved in the amount of time it takes to cook a Hot Pocket. I get the story intention here, but this, to me, just feels like a super cheap and artificial way to give Emily something meaningful to do that moves the plot forward. And this entire issue could have been avoided if they simply gave this puzzle box, or the other two puzzle boxes, different symbols. Okay, mentioning this has brought one last thing to my attention, and that's Requiem's bizarre lack of puzzles altogether. But you just said that, yeah, and those are like the only puzzles in the entire game. Whether certain fans realize it or not, puzzles are an integral part of Resident Evil's identity. Some of the most memorable parts of a Resident Evil game are its puzzles. But it seems as if these RE Engine games' idea of puzzles is gathering smaller items and fitting them into a bunch of slots to open a door or some shit like that. Most of the other Resident Evils had shit like this, sure, but they were also able to mix it up with shit like the painting puzzle in RE1, or the clock tower puzzle in RE3, or the church puzzle in RE4. Puzzles are essential, damn it. They're a great way of breaking up the tension while keeping the player's brain active. You gotta have them, man. Anyway, that's enough of Grace. Now it's time to talk about the middle-aged, quip-dropping, half-zombified sex demon himself, Mr. Leon Scott Kennedy. Now, with Grace's gameplay, I was pretty positive for the most part. Sure, I had a few gripes here and there, but nothing major or anything. And in the end, she wound up being my favorite of the two characters by quite the margin. Leon's gameplay, however, was not so great. In what appears to be an attempt at fleshing out RE4 Remake's combat, Requiem ended up doubling down on a lot of that game's biggest issues. But before I begin discussing any of them, I think it'd be best for everyone if I started off with the things I did like first. First and foremost, I really did like fighting those blister-born dudes. It may be yet another enemy type where you have to pop some giant pimples in order to defeat them, but the cool thing about them is that, upon destroying one of their 4 assists, they release a sort of gas that turns nearby zombies into blister heads, which, to me, provides a nice element of strategy, as the player will have to consider enemy composition and use that to carefully plan how they engage the blisterborns and the surrounding fodder. It puts players into a situation where manipulating the enemy's positioning becomes just as significant as the usual stuff like accuracy and reading animations. You can organize which enemies you want to focus on first, lure zombies away from the blisterborns while consistently manage how you damage it, or you can just be a careless hardass and pop those zits like you're 15 years old again. It's a pretty cool enemy type, but unfortunately, outside of fighting the blisterborns, I can't say I had too much fun playing as Leon in Resident Evil Requiem. Like I said earlier, it exacerbates a lot of the things I took issue with in the Resident Evil 4 remake, most notably the parry system as well as the context-sensitive melee attacks. Both of these wound up homogenizing a lot of the combat in RE4R, but in Requiem they managed to somehow streamline these two mechanics even further, completely nullifying the entire concept of risk-taking and strategizing throughout many of the game's encounters. Like, I extended a fair bit of praise toward RE4R's parry, since it functioned as more of a resource you have to actively decide when to use as opposed to a simple get-out-of-jail-free card. But that element of resourcefulness is lost when you can just tap a button and your hatch's durability is completely restored almost instantaneously. I'm not even against the idea of this sort of mechanic, but with the way it was implemented, it makes an already risk-averse tool even less of a risk to use. It'd be one thing if the game required you to actually hold down the repair button, and the durability would slowly replenish. But no, you quite literally just push a button, watch a short animation, and then it can continue to parry like no tomorrow. And when you take the things the game allows you to parry into consideration, what we're left with is a fundamentally broken mechanic that epitomizes just how frictionless a lot of Requiem's combat truly is. There's that world-famous game design buzzword everybody loves, but it's one I feel best describes the major shortcomings of Requiem's combat. A good combat system should have the player taking risks, assessing their surroundings, expending the resources necessary to mitigate damage, etc. And throughout Leon's campaign, moments that will have the player doing any of these things are so few and far in between, it's actually crazy. I went over how fun the Blisterborns were to fight, and how they're able to reinforce the things I just mentioned, but the closest we get to a second area that does something similar is the glass floor section that comes a bit later. And I gotta hand it to him, this was a pretty fun section that's arguably the most notable highlight of Leon's campaign. It's one of those areas whose flexibility allows for a wide range of strategies to employ. You can bunch zombies together and send them to their grave, set up a zombie at the position necessary to kick them off the roof, shadow different parts of the roof to flank zombies, so on and so forth. But again, that's really the big thing I felt Leon's campaign was missing. Those areas with fun little gimmicks that'll have players reinterpret their knowledge of the game's mechanics. So much of this huge space in Raccoon City is wasted on bland sandboxes that just cram a billion zombies in. It gets so tedious so quickly. I mean, they at least try to bring back the elevator from RE4, but this just felt like an empty gesture, since here you can just stand at the opposite end and plow everything that drops down with a shotgun. The zombies standing around the adjacent building don't even bother throwing anything at Leon. Despite the fact that zombies hurling shit at you is a common enemy type, it's also relatively brief as well. It's really quite a shame just how uninspired a lot of Requiem's encounters felt for me. You may be naive enough to think that the boss fights would remedy this issue, but to be honest, they're kind of the extent of it. Resident Evil Requiem has probably my least favorite boss lineup in the entire series. And when I say that, I don't mean to imply that any of them are outright bad, because, well, none of them really are outright bad. They're very much competently designed, but they share the exact same issue. They just feel so goddamn bland. And I'd gladly take a boss fight that may be frustrating but at least somewhat original, as opposed to a lineup of bosses that are as deeply uninspired as the ones you fight in Requiem. The only one that has any sort of creative mechanics is a Super Tyrant. The obvious intention here was to give Leon an upgraded version of the bioweapon he fought at the end of RE2R, and I do think they pulled that off fairly well here. He's faster, hits harder, hits more frequently, and to top it all off, he now has the ability to hurl cars at you, which can force players to rethink things such as positioning. However, this too comes with a pretty major caveat, and that caveat is ability to, parry the fucking cars. Yeah, I get the novelty aspect of this, and I like the memes that have come out of this, but like, I don't think parrying cars is something you should be allowed to do, you get me? And I don't think I need to explain why I feel that way. Though, having said that, I thought the Super Tyrant was a pretty solid boss fight all around. I think it's pretty fun. The rest of the bosses, on the other hand, are boring as all hell. And that mainly stems from the fact that these are all boss archetypes we've already seen before. How am I supposed to have fun during a boss fight when it is something that I have literally played before? Not only that, how am I supposed to have fun when these boss fights are somehow even worse than the ones that they're blatantly imitating? Hunk is just Krauser if you game an SMG that melts your health gauge, and Gideon in his final form is literally a copy and paste of Nemesis' final form in the RE3 remake. Yeah, one of the worst games in this series was the one Requiem wanted to steal homework notes from for the literal boss of the fucking game. Can we get real for a moment? And if we're gonna talk Chunk, the Titan Spinner, and Plant 43, dude, what can I even say about these bosses? Hell, Plant 43 can hardly even be described as a boss fight. It's so unengaging. Meanwhile, Chunk and the Titan Spinner are both a case of one of my least favorite genres of boss fight. Running around a tight enclosed space to take out a giant damage sponge. I never found the silent boss fight to be engaging, mostly because they tend to feel very rinse and repeat. But Chunk in particular is a pretty shallow boss within an already shallow lineup of bosses. Hell, you can literally exploit his ass in the most hilarious manner possible. This man gets lodged in between a doorframe like he's trying to break into the local Arby's. And believe me when I say that he'll be stuck there for a good few seconds. And in that time, you can just blast his big ass head into submission, which will essentially clear half of his health with the least amount of tension and the least amount of friction humanly possible. And now that I've said the unholy F word again, allow me to spell out a couple extra thoughts regarding the game's melee attacks. I think I went over the parry as much as I needed to, so no further elaboration will be given on that topic. However, what I will say is that, even ignoring how busted the parry is, the hatchet in general is just broken beyond belief. Just a few quick swipes is all that's needed to set up a melee attack, and it comes at the expense of such little durability that it can even outright trivialize the combat entirely. And speaking of which, I don't know what the hell happened between the release of RE4 Remake and this game, but the melee mechanics feel so much worse to use in Requiem, and spoiler alert, they didn't even feel that good to use in RE4R either. But Christ, do they feel even more clunky in Requiem. Like, these finishers, dude. Why does Leon just snap onto the enemy like that? And what is it with this weird bug that'll sometimes reposition Leon following a finisher? Like, you see this shit, right? It literally slides Leon to the right. Like, what the fuck is going on? I will say that a lot of these animations do look nice and illustrate Leon's combative finesse quite well visually, but enacting them feels so goddamn stiff. The weight of this game's inertia is going to crush you like a goddamn boulder, man. Now, granted, inertia is a good thing to have in games like this to give movement a little bit of weight, but what the Resident Evil games continue to do is abuse this concept, resulting in a game where it doesn't even feel like I'm controlling a character that has legs. Every bit of movement is painfully over-animated to the game's detriment. You can't change directions or even stop on a dime. Like, what the fuck is this weird sachet Leon does when he moves to either the left or the right while sprinting? This was also the case for the other RE Engine games, sure, but as I had already mentioned, Requiem exacerbates this issue. Now, movement that was already pretty sluggish feels so slow and heavy, and the need to constantly wrestle around with the game's inability to make any sharp and precise maneuvers made for a lot of Requiem's most frustrating moments. You could make the argument that Leon's age and condition are the reason behind the game's poor movement, but that sounds like pure copium if you're asking me. Like, if you wanted to articulate Leon's deteriorating physical state, maybe don't do so in ways that actively make the game feel worse to play. The last thing I want to touch on before I move on to my next topic is this new mechanic that Requiem introduces. On top of having contextual finishers, Leon can also use nearby weapons left on the ground, typically dropped by defeated zombies. These are also accessed through button prompts, and normally I wouldn't have much to say about a mechanic like this beyond, oh, it's cool, it's this nice little thing that exists, okay. But the way it was implemented further proves my point regarding the lack of risk-taking present in the game's combat. Matter of fact, it might actually be the extent of this issue, on top of the fact that you have literally zero control over it. Leon has iframes throughout the entire animation cycle, and you are always guaranteed to hit an enemy. Hell, it won't even let you pick up these weapons if it wouldn't result in a successful strike. And to elaborate on why I think this is a bad thing, well, it's quite simple actually. Mechanics like this work when the player is granted agency over their use. You have to actively decide when and how you're going to use it. The game should allow you the freedom to pick your targets regardless if it may or may not miss. That's how you craft a mechanic that's actually satisfying and fun to use. It should not function as a simple button prompt that guarantees a kill. It should not be something that feels automated. That just makes for an incredibly boring and shallow mechanic. Also, if we're going to say on the topic of automation, should I even have to explain why a game picking targets for you is a bad thing? What if that wasn't the enemy I intended to hit, huh? What about that, huh? That exact thought was on my mind nearly every time I decided to use one of those spears laying around. Yeah, overall, I was honestly quite shocked to see just how little I enjoyed Leon's campaign. Going into Requiem, I thought for sure the opposite would happen, that Grace's survival horror would feel watered down and uninteresting, while Leon's was an endless array of fun carnage. There's still plenty to enjoy about Leon's gameplay, don't get me wrong, but there were just far too many caveats for me to consider an improvement over the RE4 remake. He plays worse, controls worse, many of the mechanics they brought over weren't as interesting, the bosses suck, etc. So, in terms of structure, Resident Evil Requiem is a bit of a hot mess. You spend a majority of the first 50 or so % of the game playing as Grace, with a few brief Leon segments thrown into the mix to break up the tension. And honestly, I was vibing with it for the most part. Sure, some of these Leon sections were a bit too brief, one of them is literally 10 minutes at most, but aside from that, I think the first half of RE9 was paced fairly well. It's when you get to Raccoon City where this game just stomps on the brake pedals. Once Leon is granted his first dedicated section, it's pretty much his game throughout the remainder of it. Sans a pretty brief section with Grace I was able to finish in about 20 minutes. Okay, I was lying, there is one other section where you play as Grace, and it exists solely to give players an opportunity to say before the final boss. Now, the problem isn't exactly how these two characters were split up throughout the story. Granted, it is a problem, and I think a 50-50 split would have been ideal, but it's one I'm not too surprised ended up happening because no fucking shit Leon was going to get a majority of the spotlight. No, the problem with the second half of RE9 is how ridiculously slow it is, and how padded the detonator section is. From what I've seen within the community and whatnot, this section has already become pretty infamous, with many players naming it the low point of the game, and Christ, for once I actually agree with the common consensus. The detonator section isn't bad in the sense of what it's asking you to do, since this sort of thing is kind of rudimentary for Resident Evil at this point, but rather the problem lies in how it's structured. You have to traverse across a huge barren wasteland, the 3 points highlighted on the map, and in between these points lie a variety of detours and combat rooms where you'll need to find batteries, but later on find gasoline, but later on lower a bridge just to return to street level. Yeah, I think what I'm trying to say here is that, holy shit, this section goes on for fucking ever. It's like, anytime I felt as if I made some sort of progress in unlocking the map, the game just forces me to do some mundane task that does nothing but pad out an already pretty large area. I think they could have used a space to create a few more of those unique combat rooms I was suggesting earlier. You know, something that's at least somewhat interesting instead of this pure time-wasting bullshit. Shout out to the motorcycle sequence, by the way. You all knew I was going to bring it up, so I might as well do so here. Call me a Debbie Downer or whatever the hell you want to call me, but I thought this part of the game sucked ass. Not because of the concept, because it sort of thing fits Leon's character, and his insistence on being as radical as possible, but in a gameplay sense, it reeks like an unwashed ass. The game allows you to maneuver the motorcycle yourself, yet weirdly enough, it can still control itself and drive through the entire area without any player input. The only thing the player is actually tasked to control themselves is the gun in Leon's hand. But I think at this point, I've gone over enough of the gameplay. I didn't get across every single point I wanted to make, but if I keep going any farther, then this video is going to end up being one of those 4-hour video essays you see people whine about on Twitter for clout. So I guess now would be the perfect time to move on to the narrative of Resident Evil Requiem. Oh my god, where do I begin? You know what? Why don't I begin here with why don't I begin with something that diehard fans have been pointing out? Like, even diehard fans of Requiem have pointed out this issue, so, you know, it's easy to talk about. Why don't I just start here? It's a pretty big missed opportunity, and a pretty damn egregious one at that, so why don't I just start here, man? I'm going to try and wrap up this topic as quick as I can, but for an entry loaded to the brim with fan service and nostalgia, Resident Evil Requiem winds up ignoring a good chunk of its legacy characters, despite how relevant a lot of them are to the events of the Outbreak. Not getting the chance to play as them is fine, them not showing up in the story at all is weird, but the fact that characters like Claire, nor Jill, nor Rebecca are even mentioned outside of like a single file, I think, is absolutely ridiculous. Like, fuck man, you gave Sherry an important role in the story, and Leon's return to both the RPD and the orphanage would have been the perfect time for both of them to reminisce on their little adventures with Claire way back then. But no, we don't even receive as much as a gesture or even a hint. Claire is not mentioned a single time in this entire game. I don't even think she's mentioned in any of the files. But hey, at least Jill's hat is present. See, we didn't forget about her. Here's her hat, man. Look at it. Look at it. Jesus fucking Christ, man. Fucking Barry had more of a presence in the story than Jill or Claire. And don't take this as I'm attempting to slander the good name of Barry Burton, because I do love me some Barry Burton action. But it's just so bizarre to me that they'd give him such an interesting puzzle and more references in general, as opposed to the character who was literally at the police department when shit went down back in '98. Moreover, the whole motif of this game's story is the lingering effects of the T-virus. Leon, Sherry, and everybody else exposed to it are experiencing symptoms. Surely the same can be said about someone who was literally in the same position as Leon all those years ago. We all know Jill received the vaccine in RE3, but how's my girl Claire or Rebecca holding up? Have they already mutated? Are they going through exactly what Leon's going through? Well, who knows? Wait until Capcom remembers they exist, I guess. I, as well as several other fans of the series, had started to grow increasingly frustrated over Capcom's insistence on ignoring a lot of the women of the franchise. But this shit right here? Yeah, not to sound dramatic, but this is my breaking point, and I think it's a breaking point for a lot of other people as well. It gets even worse when you think about the direction the series has taken post-RE6. Like, think about it for a second. If Capcom didn't remake any of the classic games, the last time Claire and Jill would have an appearance in a Resident Evil game, two of the most essential characters in the franchise's lore, would be back when Reebok were still making NFL jerseys. I was in 5th grade the last time either of these characters appeared in a non-remake title. Let that sink in and then try to tell me that flat ignoring them in a sequel literally meant to conclude the frickin' Umbrella arc isn't total bullshit. Like, what are we doing, man? I'm holding my breath for RE10, a game that seems like it's going to have stakes out the ass, so maybe then, we'll get to see the legacy character who isn't fucking Leon or Chris for once, as much as I do enjoy those two characters. And again, Requiem is very heavy-handed with its nostalgia. I don't want to get too ahead of myself and label it as pandering, because that's taking things a bit too far. However, with all these referential Easter eggs and tidbits, it's just a bit silly to not extend any of this towards some of the most important characters in Resident Evil history. But I've said my piece, so now I'm just going to move on to something that is also pretty egregious, but is balanced out by just how utterly hilarious it is. Or should I say, how utterly hilarious he is. What the holy hell was the point of this character? What the hell does Xeno even fucking do? What is his purpose? Okay, I know what his purpose in the whole story is. He's more of like an establishing villain who seems like he's going to set up like the whole connection scene that RE10 is more than likely gonna be about. What does my man Xeno actually do? He just does his master's bidding and then is quickly discarded in the most unceremonious way you could possibly come up with. He's also just really, really stupid, which winds up making the entire story suffer as a result. Either that or he's so indebted to Gideon that he doesn't even bother questioning him on anything. You feel this the most during that one cutscene where Xeno goes on about how Grace was created in order to unlock Elpis or whatever. And as he's going through the multiple failed attempts to clone Grace, we come across one that takes us all the way back to 1990, an entire decade plus before Grace was even born. Did Xeno neglect to notice this, or is he under the impression that Grace is actually like 40 years old or something? Like, damn Grace, what's your skincare routine? This had to have been intentional to make Xeno look like one of those egotistical, I'm too good to read the fine print kind of baddie, because there's no way in hell the writers would allow such a glaring plot hole to slip through the crack. It would help to explain why he outright ignores Grace as she explains the true intention behind Elpis. Like, if I squint my eyes hard enough, I can kinda see what they were going for with Xeno, but I think they just fumbled the bag with him. He doesn't have nearly enough of a presence in the story to be considered a worthwhile antagonist, and all of his best traits were stolen from a much more superior character. Not to mention that his entire presence in the story can be boiled down to being a henchman that brings our characters where they need to be and when. That reminds me, I'm not sure why they made this dude a clone of Wesker. Like, what story purpose does this even serve? I thought we were all done with the Wesker children anyway. And apparently it doesn't even matter to Leon or Sherry, as not once did they even bother commenting on it. You'd think that a Control-C, Control-V'd Wesker running around would be a pretty major oh shit moment, but the game only acknowledges this at the very end when Gideon ridicules Xeno over it. Yeah, very engaging antagonist, guys. I guess we'll have to, God forbid, wait for some goddamn DLC to drop so we can get the answers many of us are looking for, because as it stands now, Xeno has got to be one of the weakest characters this series has ever seen. Also, from a gameplay perspective, Xeno is completely wasted. You mean to sit here and tell me that this man doesn't get a boss fight? Despite the story having multiple moments where one could have been implemented. Remember when Leon and Grace initially escaped Xeno's grasp? I could easily see a boss fight between them here. It just feels like a wasted opportunity, methinks. Like, this man can shimmy shake to dodge live ammunition, and carries a gun that turns bitches into Hawaiian Punch. And yet you're not gonna give us a boss battle with him? How lame is that? 0 out of 10 character, fuck off. I'm gonna go ahead and check one last thing off my list before I close out the video with some Grace and Leon character analysis. No, it's not shit like the crappy plot twist or even some of the questionable writing, because I don't have the energy for that. Sure, I could go over just how deeply broken the narrative is, how a vast majority of its plot is predicated on leaps of logic, or contrivances so ridiculous it actually reaches fanfiction territory on numerous occasions. But, motherfucker, have you seen how long this goddamn video is? Anyway, one concern I will point out has to do with a pretty major retcon this game pulls right at the ass end of the story. Immediately before the finale, Grace stumbles upon a terminal where she accesses a video file that shows Oswald Spencer lamenting on his regrets and his desire to atone for his crimes, which, as we all know, was a catalyst behind Elpis. The video in question also shows little baby Grace, implying that this was filmed sometime around 9/11. But this is where things start to get a little weird. Because if you played Resident Evil 5 and were aware of what Spencer was up to before his death in 2006, you'd realize that something ain't adding up here. I'm sorry, but I find it so hard to believe that this guy would pursue things like atonement, because even before his death, he was still acting like some sort of god. Which leads me to believe that the inevitable Resident Evil 5 remake is going to retcon a lot of the shit with Spencer, and to be honest, I don't really care for that one bit. Like, why do we even have to do shit like this in the first place? Is it so wrong for an unambiguously evil person to, you know, stay unambiguously evil? If you want to get all sappy and mournful with a villain, then Oswald fucking Spencer is the last one that should receive this sort of treatment. The dude is textbook scum. He contracted a man to build a mansion as a front for his experiments, kidnapped said family, held their child hostage for experiments, ordered the construction of an orphanage to experiment on even more children, ordered assassinations of his subordinates the moment he sensed the slightest bit of strain or mistrust, was responsible for the viral outbreak that killed who knows how many. I could go on, but I think you can see my point by now. Yeah, we're somehow expected to believe that this fucking guy just secretly kept an antiviral as a means of atonement. Miss me with that shit. I don't buy it. I don't buy the whole dementia thing listed in the Grace report either. I'll ask again. Why can't the wicked old man with a god complex stay a wicked old man with a god complex? I understand that they're trying to recanonize the series through these remakes, because, yeah, admittedly the original continuity was a bit messy, partly thanks to the damage RE6 caused. However, changes like this completely obfuscate so many important details of the lore, and then they're starting to get so discombobulated that I'm kind of fearful for what both the RE5 remake as well as RE10 are going to pull story-wise. Thanks to the prolonged meddling these newer games continue to do with the overarching story, I'm honestly afraid we're on the verge of reaching RE6 territory, where everything just becomes one giant clusterfuck that Capcom will have no choice but to soft boot with the series once again. Seriously, cut this shit out, like, goddamn. Okay, so like, Requiem's story is really bad, especially in the second half, where everything becomes a muddled mess of massive oversights, unanswered questions, and shit we're forced to wait until DLC or even future entries to drop, just so we can get some much needed clarity on things we probably should have received clarity for in the fucking main story. Come on, man! However, when it comes to the two characters we control, I think this is the one area where Requiem's story shines. Yeah, I want to try and end this video on a positive note, given that the past half hour or so has been pretty negative, and I don't want to give my viewers the impression that I hate or even dislike this game. But before I analyze either of these characters, I gotta say something rather important first. Leave my girl Grace alone, you sons of bitches! You absolute troglodytes! I've seen the weird-ass shit you say about her on the internet, some of which is so violently misogynistic I have to wonder if everything's okay with you upstairs. Like, you alright, man? You sure your brain is functioning pretty well? And I, for one, find your character to be a breath of fresh air. for once we have a playable Resident Evil character who has no experience in combat or anything of the sort. A character who feels far more believable in a survival horror setting than any other character in the series thus far. To the people whining about how she stammers and stutters too much, I'll ask you, what the fuck would you do in this situation? You sure as shit wouldn't be going around body slamming these bioweapons, I know that much. Anyway, I find Grace to be a pretty solid protagonist, one who's backed by an all-time performance from Angela Santabano, one of the most viscerally raw performances in any video game I've ever played, to be quite honest. Hell, during certain moments, it doesn't even feel like she was even acting, but more so witnessing these traumatic moments herself, in person. Like, did they actually kill her own mother right in the middle of the recording booth? I'm inclined to believe so, because how else could someone bring out such a painfully realistic reaction to an experience such as this? And listen, I don't mean to posture or pretend I'm someone who never gets disturbed, but truth be told, it is rather difficult to make me feel terrified or unnerved, or whatever word you want to use. However, during these moments where Grace was just completely losing it over the deaths of both Alyssa and Emily, yeah, it got the hair on my body to stand up straight, let's just put it that way. Oh, and don't think I could possibly forget about the elevator scene. That blood-curdling scream Grace lets out legit had me thinking that the collapsing elevator had taken her foot along with it. I think that, all in all, for a character meant to have reactions, motivations, and growth defined by a sense of realism, Angela's performance was instrumental in bringing such a character to life and allowing that sense of realism to really shine through. It provided the game with an edge of terror and humanity, the likes of which I don't remember seeing in any of the past Resident Evil titles, and I can't possibly neglect good old Saint Nick's performance as Leon, which is also fantastic mainly because it works as a sort of full circle moment for the voice actor and his relationship with the characters he's portraying. By now, the man has voiced Leon in the 3 biggest eras of the character's life, and he does so in very convincing fashion. But bringing our attention back to Grace, in regards to the character herself, I think she's a pretty solid protagonist with a strong, believable character arc that is, again, pretty relatable and doesn't seem very far from what an average person in her stead might go through. A running theme present within the story is the capacity people have to overcome failure and become stronger. And I think that this idea was expressed pretty well through her character arc. And to articulate my point, allow me to point out a detail that seems insignificant on the surface, but ends up being the telltale sign of her character's growth. Take a look at the first instance where she has a weapon drawn early on in the game. She's jittery, she can't hold it right. She'd probably miss a target that's 5 feet in front of her. But take a look at the last time she holds a gun. Not only is she able to hold it more confidently, but she's got the muzzle pressed against her goddamn head. It's the perfect way to communicate the amount of willpower she's gained over the course of the game. The fact that she no longer wants to allow any of her past failures to consume her. The fact that she knows full well the right thing to do now. A person who was once too afraid to even make any friends, as shown in one of the files you obtain, now has the confidence to put her foot forward and help save the day and lead a new life with Emily. Who was killed, but not actually. Yeah, it's a bit funky. Apparently, Leon deliberately missed Emily's vitals as she mutated into a crack-headed version of Domo-kun. But like, why did he have to wait until the ass end of the game to tell her that? I guess he just conveniently forgot to, otherwise we wouldn't have been able to move the plot forward. I do think it's nice that Emily wound up becoming something of a sister figure for Grace, but I can't help but feel as if the writers walked back on what was an otherwise beautifully tragic end to her character. Leon, on the other hand, there's not much I can say about him. However, and this may not have been intentional, but I do think that his T-virus infection is a nice means of symbolizing how he continues to be haunted by the Raccoon City incident, and I do think Requiem explores his trauma fairly well, even if some of the flashbacks and references are a bit too on the nose for my liking. I will say this though, that rendition of the original RPD theme, fucking immaculate shit right there. Legit blew my mind when I first heard it. But getting back to Leon's characterization, Requiem is able to shed some more light on the tragedy angles surrounding Leon, which made for some of the story's most invested moments. Leon is more vulnerable and open than he's ever been before, and I think that's pretty cool to see. Like, shit like this leads me to believe that this is some of the strongest characterization we've seen with Leon, like, in the entire series. I'm still an RE2 and RE4 OG boy at heart, but goddamn, I think Leon was portrayed pretty well here. And while this game does admittedly get a bit too carried away with hype moments, I gotta hand it to them. As a fan of this series for a pretty long time, and as someone who has a lot of investment in this world, lore, and characters, seeing Leon, all old and zombified, fighting tooth and nail to bury Umbrella's last skeleton as he puts it, it got me pretty excited. The excitement diminished as soon as I realized how painfully mediocre the final boss was, but regardless, stuff like this really had me hooked. Mechanically, the final boss is total rubbish, but thematically, it works as a pretty cool full circle moment for Leon. All those years of suffering from all that guilt, all that trauma, the insecurity of not being able to make a difference. He's now faced with the golden opportunity to put it all behind him, fuck Gideon's shit up, and finally finish what he started nearly 3 decades ago. It's a pretty solid moment in what was an otherwise pretty crappy narrative. It is a bit strange that Gideon's a nemesis form, for a variety of different reasons. But don't worry about that, just soak in the sheer motherfucking aura of the battle, baby, yeah! And I think that right there, that sentiment I just expressed, really expresses my overall thoughts on Resident Evil Requiem. It's a video game that accomplishes a lot of different things, some of which ended up being series highlights, but almost everything came with a caveat of some sort. It gave us an emotionally resonant story for longtime fans of Leon Kennedy to really sink their teeth into, on top of providing us with a good new protagonist, but the story surrounding them is so fundamentally broken, you would have to rewrite the entire damn thing just to get something somewhat coherent. The gameplay presents and even capitalizes on a lot of unique ideas, but it never goes anywhere else with them past the first half of the game. Throughout my first 2 sessions of playing, I'll admit I was like a kid in a candy store, bouncing off the walls, screaming to the top of my lungs, "Yes! Finally! Resident Evil is back, bitches! Oh, how I should have trusted you, Capcom!" It felt like the most logical evolution point for a lot of the franchise's principles, but unfortunately, my opinion on the game soured as I delved further and further into it. It's a game that has a 9 out of 10 first half, but a 4 out of 10 second half. And that's about as good as a description of this game as any. For what it's worth, I did enjoy my time with Resident Evil Requiem, and an Insanity playthrough certainly isn't off the table. Hell, maybe when I do play it, I'll make a follow-up video if need be. But for now, I think I'll go ahead and give Resident Evil Requiem a light 6 to a strong 7. See you bitches later.